Well, the Labour MP Rupert Huck on the committee asked Robbie Gibb about a piece that he'd written for The Telegraph back in 2020, stating that BBC journalists are letting their preferences show. Rupert Huck mentioned what she called an attack on the journalist Lewis Goodall. You know him, he's sitting here right in front of me. She asks whether Robbie Gibb, still holds those views about the BBC, and here's a bit of his response.
I know lots of BBC journalists. I know their politics because I've been around the BBC a long time. People from very much from the left. They are, you could not tell for one second. And you mentioned Lewis Goodall. I think Lewis Goodall is a very, very talented journalist. So much so, I was the person that recruited him into the BBC in the first place. And on the basis that he came from the IPPR, he was a talented guy, and I wanted to bring people with a diversity of opinion into the BBC. My issues are not particularly focusing on him, is that where people, and that's what I was writing about at the time before I joined the board, where journalists behave in a way which the public know where they're coming from. That is a real problem. One of the things, another credit to Tim Davie and his management of the BBC, introducing some very, very clear guidelines for Twitter, X, and you don't really see those stories anymore. I think the BBC have cracked it.
Well, Lewis Goodall is with me now, presenter of Sundays with Lewis Goodall and co-host of the global podcast The News Agents, which today I know you're talking about those exchanges, Lewis. A talented guy. Were you expecting to be mentioned in that exchange?
I mean, yes, Robbie was a bit of a father figure for me, as I think you can tell there. He was just such a paternal, benign presence in the newsroom. Look,
you do not think that, to be clear, in case people are missing the sarcasm.
Yes, well, indeed, very, very Darth Vader. I was his father. No, Robbie Gibb is himself a talented player of the political game, and I think you could see that in the select committee yesterday, where quite frankly he and the other members of the board, him in particular, kind of ran rings around the culture select committee, which is partly a structural problem. You go from one MP to the next, and they both all have sort of, when they actually get onto a sort of interesting kind of line of argument, they run out of time and so on. But also, quite frankly, I think partly reflected the kind of politics of the committee itself.
But when he said, this is when my ears pricked up, I must say, when he said, it's not my concerns weren't particularly focused on Lewis Goodall, and he had all those nice things to say about you. You're on record as saying that, in a sense, the opposite is true, that he did focus on you and your work and almost investigate it.
Well, look, I was made aware, and I don't think I'm the only person to whom this has happened, is my understanding. I was made aware at the time that Sir Robbie was, as one executive put it to me at the time, that he was watching you and that I had to be careful about everything that I was doing, which was obviously quite chilling and certainly not appropriate, in my view, for a non-executive director of the board to be getting involved in that sort of almost management of personnel. And indeed, I think that what was disappointing about the committee yesterday was that there were not more questions asked about, not just, my case is relatively trivial, but the sort of pattern of behaviour which other people internally at the BBC have talked about, whether it is normal for a non-executive director to be getting involved in giving his views on day-to-day editorial matters and questions. For example, at one point going into the sort of Newsnight offices and sort of giving a series of views about their coverage, providing views about appointment of staff, including other sort of other people coming into the BBC, including the journalist, for example, Jess Brammer, which he sort of fought against. And I don't want to, I for so many reasons, I don't particularly want to talk about Robbie Gibb and about the BBC. I think it's an institution that in many ways is becoming less and less relevant to our lives.
But the reason he matters and that dynamic that you're describing, yes, and his version of it that he described yesterday, is that it is about the governance of the BBC, and the governance of the BBC is central to whether its editorial arm works well, isn't it? That's the rub here.
I think there are a couple of questions about all of this. One is, so Robbie there talked about the idea of his knowing about the politics of particular BBC journalists, and talked about the idea of his leaving his politics at the door, that impartiality goes through his bones. I have to say, That was not my experience at the BBC, and I know that that was not the experience of many others since, who have said very clearly that they feel that Sir Robbie, from his perch within the governance structures of the BBC, interferes consistently from a particular political direction. And that he does that, and I, in fairness to him, as I've written, I think he, in his own head, he is doing this for what he believes are the right reasons, which he's got this obsession, this idea that the BBC's coverage is permanently skewed against the right and left. Now, the interesting thing about the exchanges yesterday, one of the relatively few interesting things, but one of the interesting things was, when repeatedly asked to provide evidence for a sort of institutional bias, both Sir Robbie and Michael Prescott, who was the man who delivered this now sort of infamous dossier about BBC coverage, weren't able really to provide very much evidence. Beyond, from what I could see, was just a kind of instinct and a hunch, which ironically enough, of course, Sheila, is a prejudice. It is a bias. It is a belief.
And we all have instincts and hunches, and we can all find something that will feed them.
Of course. And my problem, I think, and I think a lot of people who work at the BBC's problem with that particular dossier and the way that this has all been done, is that if you read the interest, it reads like a sort of collection of hobby horses and almost a kind of checklist of all of the various neuroses that the cultural and political right have, whether it's sort of talking about kind of, you know, using words like lawfare with regards to President Trump, the sort of obsession about this particular edit, you know, sort of the coverage on Gaza, coverage on all sorts of different things. And any one of those, indeed all of those, may have some legitimacy to it. And as we know, any broadcast organiser, as incidents. But what about the criticisms and critiques which come from the other part of the spectrum? Over-representation of, say, reform politicians, under-representation of Lib Dems or Greens, the over-reliance on kind of sort of right-wing, traditional kind of economic orthodoxies, talking about the government maxing out the credit card. You know, you could go on and on. So I would have a lot more time for that process if I could see genuine evidence that the people themselves who are prosecuting this from within the BBC were applying the same level of introspection to themselves and their own biases and their own prejudices as they seem so willing to subject others to. There's an old question in politics, Sheila, which I think goes to the heart of this, which is, who guards the guardians? And my question, if I'd been on that select committee yesterday, would have been to say,
who guards you lot?
Indeed, A, what scrutiny are you doing to apply to your own views and your own politics, which do exist? And B, when you're going around sort of launching these investigations into this, that and the other, who's scrutinising what you do? Who is scrutinising your work? What is the process and set of processes into how these different investigations go about? Because if you don't have good answers to that, it starts to feel a little bit like a star chamber, which I know some people at the BBC do feel.
And let's talk a bit about something that emerged, just a couple of hours ago, which is an edit by the BBC to the Reith Lectures. Now, for people who don't know what the Reith Lectures are, tell us a bit about that and what this edit is.
So I think, Sheila, this story which has emerged literally in the last hour or two, is exactly the problem with what the BBC has done to itself. So the Reith Lectures, in case people don't know, they are a very prestigious set of lectures, annual lectures, which are delivered on Radio 4 and on the World Service, which I think could be germane for reasons we can talk about, by a very distinguished figure, sometimes an academic, sometimes a distinguished sort of cultural figure, politician or whatever it happens
historian,
to be. Goes back 75 years. It's a really prestigious thing.
It can be, it's essentially a deep dive into an issue like the law or culture or whatever.
Law, politics, culture, science, whatever it happens to be. Now, this year, the privilege of delivering these lectures fell to Rutger Bregman. Now, Mr. Bregman is a Dutch author, historian, a very distinguished historian. And he delivered the first of these lectures in person at the BBC Radio Theatre at the end of October, on the 28th of October, I think it was. And keep that date in mind because I think it matters to the timeline of the story. Now, he delivered that lecture about the future of democracy and so on. And in it contained a line on the 28th where he said that President Trump was, quotes, the most openly corrupt president in American history. Now, that lecture, delivered at the end of October, was broadcast for the first time this morning on Radio 4. That line had mysteriously vanished. And Mr. Bregman, upon hearing this, Mr. Bregman, upon hearing this, has been very unhappy about it and issued his own statement online this morning. Just listen to this.
But the BBC has decided to censor the opening lecture of a series they invited me to give. They deleted the sentence in which I described Donald Trump as the most openly corrupt president in American history. That line is gone. It has been removed from the version broadcast this morning on BBC Radio 4. Last Wednesday, I was told the sentence was being discussed with US lawyers and at the highest levels inside the BBC. For days, they couldn't give me an answer. Yesterday, they finally did. And the irony could not be bigger. Because this lecture, titled A Time of Monsters, is exactly about the cowardice of today's elites. About universities, corporations, and yes, media networks bending the knee to authoritarianism.
So the question there, actually, you can hear the anger from Mr. Bregman, but the question there, of course, is that this is a very prestigious set of lectures. I'm sure BBC executives will have reviewed this text, Radio 4 executives and so on, will review this text, when it was delivered at the end of October in front of a sort of hand-picked audience of very sort of influential people and so on. They didn't have a problem with it then. Why do they have a problem with it now? And of course, that was on the 28th of October. When did the dossier, which leaked to the Telegraph, appear, which caused all of this fiasco about the Panorama edit? Well, that was the 3rd of November. And since then, we've obviously had the threat of legal action from the White House. And the BBC have themselves accepted that they removed that line on the basis of legal advice. There's a statement today saying, all of our programmes are required to comply with the BBC's editorial guidelines. We made this decision to remove one sentence from the lecture on legal advice, i.e. the chill wind from the White House is already rippling through New Broadcasting House and their coverage. And by the way, this isn't a journalist who's doing this. That might be one thing with the BBC journalists. The whole point of these lectures is they are supposed to be informed, cerebral, grounded,
fresh
reasoned,
voice,
but provocative, to give us something to think about. And it is pretty disturbing, I think, that the BBC has got itself into a position where, because of an obsession about a certain element of Trump coverage, that it is now censoring what is going out on the BBC because of the threat of legal action. That is what legal action from the Trump White House is designed to do. It's designed to scare journalists. And unfortunately, this seems to have happened.
Let me say this and ask your take on it, or just your thoughts on it, really. A lot of people listening to you and I today, and we're both ex-BBC people, so obviously this interests us in a particular way, but that's not what I want my conversation with the callers to be about. Most of them probably don't listen to the Reith Lectures. No. Most of them will get their daily news maybe from it. Their kids will watch CBeebies.
Well, they listen to LBC, so rightly they don't need to.
A bit of both.
Yeah.
They'll get they're still listening to BBC. We can't get away from that. The kids will watch CBeebies. They'll have a favourite soap. They'll love Strictly and/or Traitors, and they'll see it for big sport coverage as well. That's just a sort of broad spectrum of the kind of viewing and listening habits that people have in this country. So why does this matter?
Well, I think it matters. There's a couple of reasons that it matters. One is that it goes to the heart of exactly what this whole BBC story has been about, which is, what does impartiality mean? And I think, unfortunately, and we saw this on display yesterday from Robbie Gibb and from some of the others, I think that the view which has prevailed at the BBC too much in recent years, mistakes are always made, but the view on impartiality has been a sort of milquetoast one, a feeble one. It's been one which basically says... It basically says that if no one complains about something, then we've succeeded. That is not impartiality. In fact, it's the opposite of impartiality. The job of impartiality should not be to manage perception. It should be to represent fact. The fact of the matter is that with regards to this statement from Mr. Bregman, the idea that Donald Trump is the most openly corrupt president in United States history clearly would have a lot of credibility if it were ever to come up in a court of law, right?
I was about to say, for people who might not be familiar with the word due is put in front of the word impartiality.
Indeed,
impartiality where it is due. And truth is an absolute defence.
Indeed so. And, there's two things going on there. One, most American presidents, they have their flaws, and some of them can be venal, and some can have, sexual peccadillos, and some could be liars, and whatever it happens to be. Very few have been brazenly corrupt.
And openly so.
And openly so.
Which
and
is his word,
and
yeah.
let's not forget, let's just take one example of a form of corruption, which is, of course, trying to overthrow an election. Donald Trump literally said to a Georgia election official, I just need to find 11,000 votes, right? He tried to overturn an election. That is a form of corruption. So just that alone, let alone the that is established fact. And so if the BBC is not in a position to be able to say without fear or favour what the truth is, then frankly I think they might need to pack up and go home. Because once you get, and you saw this in the committee yesterday as well, you had the absurdity of Mr. Prescott, who I'm sure, gave a perfectly fluid performance, but nonetheless positing the idea, I'm afraid just showed that he didn't have a very good grasp of what true impartial journalism actually is, because he was positing the idea that he was very surprised, even though he himself had watched the Panorama when it went out and actually had not noticed the sort of dreaded edit, which tells you something in itself. But the fact that his justification was to say, well, I thought it might be fine because I was assumed there would be a show on Kamala Harris the next week. Kamala Harris had not been president. Kamala Harris had not tried to overturn an election. That is an ersatz, feeble, stupid understanding of what impartiality is. Impartiality isn't on the one hand
we
this,
spoke about
on the one
X
hand
this
that.
week, so we need to speak about why the following
Impartiality, ultimately, when it comes down to it, is saying the truth, and then once you've said the truth, if people don't like it, tough luck. There is an inscription that is often talked about, right, from outside BBC headquarters, from George Orwell, who of course once worked at the BBC, which says that freedom, if it is to mean anything at all, is the ability to tell people they do things that they do not want to hear. And in my view, the BBC has not lived up to that maxim for some time enough. And
it's fairly newly there, that statue, isn't it, in the last few
years?
Indeed
so. Yeah, and by the way, and that's not lots of very hard-working journalists still within the BBC it's really hard for them at the moment. I'm talking about elements of BBC management.